In this video, I'd like to introduce you to the Revit home screen. Now, the home screen is simply the screen that greets you when you first launch the software and you don't yet have a project file open. Now, if it's the very first time you're launching the software and you've just installed it, you may also see this message over on the right-hand side of the screen that says, "Hello there." This is a wizard that will ask you some questions and potentially customize your Revit interface to suit your own personal preferences and the job you do and what kind of tools you're interested in. So in order to run this wizard, you would just simply click the start button here and it would ask you a few questions, and then it'll customize your experience a little bit. In this case, I'm going to ignore that. I would rather just have the full interface at my disposal. You can always go back and modify your Revit user interface anytime. So even if you've gone through the wizard previously and answered some questions and you decided you wanted to change your mind, then you can always get back to the options dialog and make changes to that later. And I'll show you where that is in a moment. So I'm just going to close this without going through that wizard. And instead, I want to focus here on the home screen. So the home screen is organized into a few key areas. On the left-hand side, we have some buttons to work with either models or families. These are two different types of Revit files. So a model file is typically your project file that contains all the geometry that will make up your building model. And you can either open an existing one or create a new one with the buttons over there on the left. Families are typically components that you'll place within a model file. So think of those as like furniture and equipment, and they also have open and new buttons over there for those kinds of objects. Now, we're going to talk about both of these kinds of files throughout the course, but for now, I just wanted to point out those buttons to you. Now, beneath that, you're going to see that there are three areas here that are almost like tabs. So we're currently on the one called Recent Files. And with that selected, you will see the Recent Files screen on the right-hand side. But if I were to switch to Autodesk Docs or My Insights, it would change the screen to show different things. Now, Insights you can almost think of as like an analytics tool within Revit. Since I've just installed Revit, I don't really have anything useful here yet to show, but over time it will start to accumulate information about my usage of Revit and maybe suggest some things about how I might want to use the software. And so you might want to check back here after you've been using Revit for a while. If you're using Revit in the cloud, then you will have access to items here under Autodesk Docs. So you can see that right now I'm not logged into anything, so I don't have anything showing here, but on your own work and in your own office, if you are a cloud-based user, then you will see some stuff here, and you can talk to your administrators there in the office to figure out how to access cloud-based projects. So for us, I'm just going to switch back to Recent Files, which is locally based files that are on this computer. And what I'm seeing on the right-hand side is the sample files that come with the software. So what you see on your screen might look a little different depending on whether you've already started using Revit. So if you've already started using Revit, what happens is that as you open and close files, they will show up on this list in the order that they were opened. So your most recently used file would appear right here, and then it would compile a list beyond that. So again, I'm seeing the sample models here because I haven't opened anything yet. Now, to open a file from the Recent Files area, you just simply click on it. And so I'm going to click on the architectural model that's there, but you can click on literally anything that shows up there. So whatever that first entry is for you, just go ahead and click it and it will open that file. We're not going to do anything in this file, so we're going to be closing it in just a moment, but I just wanted to show you how that functions on the Recent Files screen. You just simply click an item and it will load it up in the Revit interface. The most important thing to note here is that the interface changes. Okay, now this sample model is read-only, so I'm just going to click that continue opening the file here. But you'll notice that the interface changes because I'm now in the project environment. We're going to talk about this interface in a future video, but I do want to show you that all it's done is hidden the Recent File screen, that home screen that we were on before. And you can get back to the home screen using this icon at the top of the screen here, or you can use the Control-D keyboard shortcut, and it will take you back there. Now that architectural model is also still open, and this button right here would toggle us back. So you can see how it's easy for you to switch between the two interfaces. Now, if you're done with a file and you close it, that will also return you back to the home screen. Okay, so the home screen is sort of the default landing page if you don't have anything open, or you can choose to toggle there. Now, the last thing I want to point out to you here on this home screen is there are some help links and community links down here. I welcome you to explore those on your own. Those are just web-based resources that you can explore to learn more about Revit. But right here is this item that says New Revit Home. And this is a little switch, and you can flip this switch and it will show you a more modern version of the Revit home screen. Now you can see that the left-hand side remains largely the same. It's really just the right-hand side that has changed. You get a different grouping of icons, and they give you some options for sorting them and grouping them either in a list view or in a grid view. So it gives you more control over the formatting of those recent files, but otherwise they function exactly the same. So going forward in the course, it's entirely up to you whether you want to use the new Revit Home or the traditional Revit Home. For now, I'm going to turn off the new Revit Home and stick with the traditional one, but it's entirely up to you which one you want to use going forward. In this video, I want to give you a quick tour of the Revit user interface. So the interface has lots of pieces, and I want to kind of name everything and just kind of give you a quick look around. Now, I currently have the Revit architectural sample file open, the one that ships with the US installation. You don't have to have the same file open as me. You can open any file you like, but if you want to access this file and you don't see it on your recent file screen, if it's not listed right here, then what you can do is you can go to the File menu and go highlight Open, come down here to Sample Files, and then you're going to access it right here, Snowden Towers Sample Architectural, and then you should see the same file as me. It's already installed as part of the software. Okay, now let's talk about the user interface. So let's start at the very top left-hand corner of the screen with the Quick Access toolbar. Now, the Quick Access toolbar can be mainly thought of as just a favorites bar. So there's a number of icons there for very common commands like new, open, save, undo, and redo. And you can even right-click and customize that toolbar to your liking and add and remove commands that you use frequently. In the middle at the top, you will see the name of the current project. So in my case, that says Snowden Towers Architectural Sample. So whatever project you have open, if you just glance at the top of your screen, you should see its name listed for you there, which can be helpful, especially if you have multiple projects open at the same time. Now, beneath all of that, running across the full width of the screen is the ribbon. Now, we're going to talk about the ribbon in more detail as the course progresses, but for now, just think of that as the main user interface for accessing the various commands and functions within Revit. Now, the first tab of the ribbon is the File menu, and if you click that, it opens up a pretty standard menu of file management commands, things like new, open, save, and print. So anytime you want to do something that's file management related, then you might want to check the File menu, and there's a pretty good chance you'll find those commands there. Now, many of these work the same way. If you hover over the item with the little arrow next to it, it will expand a sub-menu with additional features. So you can see that new behaves that way, and open, and so on. Now, down at the bottom of this menu is an options button. Now, we'll talk more about some of those options in future videos, but if you click that, it opens up a dialog where you can customize your Revit experience. And of course, you can exit Revit from this menu as well, but I'm not going to click that now. What I'm going to do instead is simply click off in white space to dismiss that menu. Now, getting back to my ribbon, notice that starting with the Architecture tab, most of the commands there are grayed out and unavailable. So the reason for that is that Revit is what we call context sensitive. And so what I mean by that is what will be available to you in the user interface will depend completely on what you're currently doing or what environment you're currently in. So the reason that most of these commands are grayed out for me is because the file that I have open is open to a sheet. Now, what do I mean by a sheet? Well, let me direct your attention to the project browser. And what you'll see here is a list of views and items that you can open within the current project. Now, I'm going to scroll down, and you can see there's quite a few entries in here, but I'm going to get down to this branch called Sheets right here. And then there are a number of sheets in this sample file. And if I continue to scroll down, notice that one of them comes up as bold, G000 cover in this case.
that matches this tab right here. And that is the currently open view for this project. So the first thing that I want to point out there is that the currently open view will be bold in both the project browser and in the tab. Now, if I scroll back up to the top, you can open multiple views at the same time. So notice here, I've got this branch called floor plans, and then beneath that, I've got a number of floor plans, and I'm going to double click L1, which is going to open up the level 1 floor plan view. Now, if you're working in a different file than me, you can just open up any other view that you like. And what you'll see is that we now get a second tab here across the top. Notice that the cover sheet is still here, and I could click it and it would go back to that cover sheet, but I'm going to click back over here to the L1 floor plan. And notice that when I do that, if we direct our attention back to the ribbon, notice that all of the buttons are now available. Okay, so this is what I mean by context sensitive. In order to use most of those commands, you must be in a view that allows for those functions. So the next thing I want to direct your attention to is the properties palette. Now, this is directly above the project browser on my screen. And in this case, notice that at the top of the properties palette, there's an item here called the type selector, and it currently says floor plan. Now, the reason it says floor plan is because I'm not doing anything on screen right now. So the properties are reflecting the settings that pertain to the currently active view, which is floor plan L1. Now, notice that if I were to click back over here to the cover sheet, the properties palette would change to say sheet. And now we would be seeing the properties of that active sheet instead of the active floor plan. I'll click back to L1 and the floor plan properties. Now, the properties palette is another context-sensitive piece of the interface. So it's constantly changing, reacting to whatever it is you're doing. So for example, if I were to run a command, so let's go up here to the architecture tab of the ribbon, and let's click this first button right here, the wall tool. Now, it's not really important to me that you actually create a wall. I don't want to create a wall. I just simply want to execute the command and show you that the properties palette has changed yet again. And notice that now it's telling me about properties of this basic wall that I'm about to create. Now, in addition to that, we get some other changes that occur on the interface. Notice that the Modify tab itself has changed. It's got this bright green color now, and it says Modify Place Wall. And then beneath the ribbon, we have this new slot of options that has become available. This is called the Options bar. Now, again, it's not important that you know what all those options and settings are right now. We're going to talk about all these things in future videos. All I want you to see is the way the interface is changing depending on what it is you happen to be doing at any given time. Now, to cancel out of all of this and kind of reset, I'm going to come up here and click this Modify tool, this large pointer icon, and notice that that kind of resets the interface back, and now we're seeing the properties of the floor plan again, and we're no longer drawing a wall. Now, the view itself has some special characteristics. I want to direct your attention to the lower left-hand corner of the L1 view, and notice this series of icons that appear down here at the bottom. This is called the View Control Bar. Now, if I were to click over to the cover sheet, you'll notice it does have a view control bar as well, but it's much more compressed. It only contains 2 icons versus the number of icons that appear on the L1 view, which is significantly more. And once again, we'll talk more about these functions in the future. Now, at the very bottom of the screen, we have the status bar. Now, on the far left-hand side of the status bar, we've got various text messages, which are giving us little cues about what to do next. So maybe the next thing that we can do on screen, or if my cursor happens to be highlighting something on the screen, then it will tell me some information about that object and so on. So that's kind of a little message area. Now, in the middle of the status bar, there are some settings that we'll talk about in future videos. And then over on the far right, there are what we call some selection toggles down here. These just toggle the behavior of selection modes, and selection will be a future topic as well. So finally, we have this little floating toolbar, which is currently over on the right-hand side of my screen. Notice that it is ghosted out until I get near it, and then there are some little drop-down menus that appear, and these are navigation tools, which is also the subject of a future video. So what I'm going to do is just sort of click an empty space to dismiss that menu for the time being. But you now have a pretty good idea of what all of the different parts of the user interface are called. And really, that was the main function of this video, was to name everything so that in future videos, when I'm referring to different parts of the interface, you'll have some familiarity with which items I'm referring to. In this video, I want to show you how you can change your display theme from light to dark. So Revit does have support for a dark mode theme, and it's relatively easy to change it if that is your preference. So I'm here in the sample model, which is included with the software. If you're not sure how to get to this model, I've covered that in some of the earlier videos, so you can go back and review that there. But what I want to do is go right to the options to talk about the theme here. So that's going to be the File menu, and then I'm going to come down here to the Options button. Now, in the options dialog, we've got lots of tabs and lots of settings that we can configure here. I want to jump right to colors, which is where we're going to find the active theme. So you can see it up here at the top, UI active theme. And there are actually 3 choices. Now, mine is currently set to use system setting, and then there's also dark and light. So there's really only the 2 choices, dark and light, but what use system setting does is it makes Revit match whatever you're doing in Windows. So it's going to match the OS. So if you go into your Windows settings and you make Windows itself dark mode, then Revit will also be dark mode and vice versa. So in my case, you can see that because use system setting is on, my Windows is set to light mode and it's matching that. Now, let me direct your attention to this area here, Canvas colors. So notice that currently it's keyed into the light scheme, and then these are the colors being used for things like the background and selection and so on. If I come up here to the top and change my active UI to dark mode, let's say, notice that that also switches the canvas scheme to dark, and then it changes a number of these colors as well. And it sort of stands to reason that you would want different colors being used for those elements when you switch to dark mode so that they would be more legible on screen. Now, any of these can be customized if you wish. So if you don't like this particular color of purple or this particular color of green, you can click those buttons and change them to your own preferences. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to accept all of the defaults here. I've chosen dark at the top, and I'll click OK to see the result. And there we have Revit now in dark mode. Now, I should point out that in this current incarnation of dark mode, it only applies to what Revit calls the first level UI. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, I can't really demonstrate that in a sheet view, so I'm currently on this cover sheet here. So what I'm going to do is double-click the L1 floor plan here on my project browser. That opens up this floor plan view. And now I can get to many of the buttons on my ribbon, and I'm going to click this wall tool right here. And that takes me into this wall command. Now, I'm not going to draw a wall or do anything in the wall, but I just want to simply click on this edit type button that appears here on properties next. And this is what I mean by first level UI. Notice that the type properties window that appears is not in dark mode. It is still in light mode. So I fully suspect that in future incarnations of this feature that they will apply dark mode to all of the levels of the UI, but in its current incarnation, it's only that top level. Now, my apologies in advance if you're a fan of dark mode and you don't like that behavior. All I can say is I do expect it to improve. So I'm going to cancel out of this. And then I'm going to click the Modify tool here on the ribbon to cancel out of the Wall tool without drawing any walls. And then I'm going to go back to the File menu, go back to Options, and I personally prefer light mode, so I'm going to set it back to light mode. Now, I could choose it explicitly right here, or because my Windows is still set to light mode, I can use System Setting, and when I click OK, either way, my interface will go back to light mode. Now, one more thing I want to show you is we have what I would consider a in-between setting. So if you come over here to the View tab, on the far right, there's a button here called Canvas Theme. And if you click that, that will only toggle the canvas, the drawing windows, but notice that the rest of the UI will remain in light mode, or it would be reversed if we were in dark mode. So if I was in dark mode, my ribbons and other interface elements would be dark, but when I toggle the canvas itself would be light. So you have really what amounts to 4 different options then when you think about it, either all dark, all light, or the combo mode either way. So I encourage you to choose whatever one is your preference going forward. You're free to use whichever theme you prefer throughout the rest of the course. I personally prefer the light mode with the light canvas, so that's the mode that I'm going to switch to, and I'm going to leave mine set that way for the remainder of the course. In this video, we're going to talk about view navigation. So there's a variety of ways that we can either zoom or pan or orbit in 3D views, and I'd like to kind of walk through several of them with you. The simplest way that you can navigate is to use the wheel on your mouse. So in order to do that, you just simply roll the wheel up to zoom in or roll it down to zoom out. Now, in addition to rolling it, wherever your mouse pointer is also matters. So let me demonstrate that. Right now, my mouse pointer is in the middle of the screen. But if I move it over here to say where these historic photographs are, and then I start to roll in, notice that it's keeping that area of the view on screen as it zooms in. Okay, and I'll zoom back out again. And then I'm going to do the same thing down here with this project location map. Now, I don't have to click to select it. I just need to put my mouse in that general area and roll in, and you can see that it starts to focus in on that area. Now, once you've zoomed in on an area, if you want to adjust the screen slightly, recenter it, if you will, hold the wheel in instead of rolling it and then drag. Okay, so with it held in, it performs a panning operation, and we're able to pan in any direction we want and recenter the screen on this area. Okay, so those are the most fundamental ways that you can zoom and pan and focus in on any part of a particular view. Now, in addition to that, we've got several navigation commands available to us on the right-click menu. So if I right-click anywhere on the screen, you're going to see some zoom commands here. So we've got 3 of them. I'm going to start with the one in the middle here, zoom out 2 times, and that's pretty self-explanatory. It's exactly what it does. The one right above that was zoom in region. This one requires 2 clicks of the mouse. You get this magnifying glass, and then you click and click to make a rectangle around the part of the screen that you want to focus in on. Okay, so I'm focusing in on the project management firm on this title block here. If you want to go back to seeing the entire view, you can right-click again and choose Zoom to Fit. And that's exactly what it will do. It will make all the geometry fit the available screen. In addition to those functions, there is a previous pan zoom. And this is not just once, but you can run it several times, and it will go back through several steps of zooming and panning that you've done previously. And there's also a next option once you've done previous that would allow you to step forward and then back again. And then once again, I will do zoom to fit. Now, in addition to those right-click options, there's a navigation bar on the right-hand side of my screen. You can see it grayed out over there, but as I move my mouse closer to it, it lights up. And notice that there's a small drop-down menu available right here. And there are several options here, some of which we've already seen, like zoom in region, zoom out, and zoom to fit. But there are other choices on here as well. Now, I'd like to demonstrate this one, zoom all to fit. But in order for that one to be meaningful and to make sense, you need to have at least 2 views open simultaneously, because that command will do a zoom to fit, but it will do it on all open views instead of just the one. So let's get another view open here in order to demonstrate. Now I'm going to just simply open up the default 3D view, and I can get to it. The easiest way is using this icon up here at the top of the screen on the quick access toolbar called the default 3D view. It kind of looks like a little birdhouse. So I'm going to simply click that, and it's going to open up a new tab here labeled 3D. And you can see I'm now looking at a 3D view of the model. So now before I can show you zoom all to fit, I need to tile these 2 windows side by side. To do that, we're going to go to the View tab, and then we're going to click this Tile Views button right here, and it will put those 2 tabs next to one another in their own separate tiles. Now you can see that both views are a little bit off screen. So to correct that, we'll come back over here to this navigation bar. We'll click the little flyout menu that appears there, and now I'm going to choose Zoom All to Fit. And you will see that both sides are zoomed to fit their respective tiles. So that's the way that Zoom All to Fit works. Okay, now if you make changes to one of these views, like let's say I click over here in the 3D view, and then I zoom in and I hold the wheel down and I pan. And let's say I want to zoom alt fit again. Well, by the way, that little drop-down menu appears on both sides, so you don't have to click over into the other tab to get to it. There's a navigation bar in each of these windows. If I try to choose it again off the menu, nothing happens. So that's a weird little quirk about this menu. If it's already at the top of the pile, you've got to click the icon instead of choosing it from the menu. The only time you choose it from the menu is when you want to do something different. So zoom in region, for example, and then focus on the front of this building. But now the next time I wanted to do zoom in region, it wouldn't work. I would have to click it from the button. So again, it's a little quirky, but that's the way that particular menu behaves. Okay, so all of the zooming and panning that we've been doing, you could see it works in 2D views, it works in 3D views. But when you're in a 3D view, you have an additional option at your disposal. We could also change the orientation of the 3D view. We can orbit, okay? So to start off with, I'm going to right-click and choose Zoom to Fit so that we can see the entire 3D model. Next, instead of dragging the wheel, I'm going to hold the Shift key down and drag the wheel. So let me show you. So hold down your Shift key, push the wheel in, and then start to drag. And notice that that's going to orbit that 3D view. And not only are you able to orbit side to side, but you can also orbit up and down. So in other words, you've got a full 360 degrees of motion here, and you can change that orientation any way that you like. Now, if you happen to be zoomed in when you do this, it might be a little bit odd because things are kind of orbiting off the screen. So like we talked about with the zooming and panning, where you want to put the cursor to kind of center the screen, it doesn't work that way with 3D orbiting. But what you do instead is you simply select an element. So let's say I want to stay focused on this little park here in front of the building. So I'm going to select one of the trees in the middle of that park. And now I'm going to orbit. So you just click right on the tree and then hold the Shift key down and drag the wheel. And notice that it now stays focused on that element as I spin it around. Okay, so it's just a slightly different way of doing it, but I highly recommend that you get in the habit of selecting something first before you orbit in 3D. You'll just get a lot more control. Now, in addition to using the wheel, there's also this view cube that's up here in the corner. Now, it might be ghosted out, so kind of move your mouse there and it'll come to full intensity. Now, that view cube's in a couple pieces. There's a little flat disc at the bottom. That's more of like a turntable effect where you would only be able to spin the model. You don't change the height. And then there's the cube itself. So let me show you the turntable first. Notice that that's going to kind of spin around. Now, it'll be a little easier to see if we zoom out first. Okay. And then let's spin it around. You see how it's not changing the height at all? Even if I drag up or down, it's still keeping that height stationary. But if you click and drag the cube instead, then it behaves like a full orbit. Now, even though this is possible, I personally think it's easier to hold the Shift key in the wheel in that case. Now, the other really interesting thing about the view cube is it's got these little hotspots. So notice that there's a front face and a left and a top, and then even the corners are little hotspots. So what you can do is you can click one of those and it will spin the model around and focus in on that orientation. So it'll kind of make it match that orientation. Now, sometimes you got to click to kind of get it to do that because you could see it was sort of pausing there for a moment when I did. So if it doesn't seem to want to spin on its own, just sort of click. It's animating. And so sometimes the animation gets stuck and I find that I have to kind of click or pan or something to kind of get it unstuck. If you click one of these little hotspots at the corners, then it'll go back to being, a 3D view. And there's also a little home icon there too, which will go back to the default orientation of the 3D view. Now, what's interesting about this is if you select something first and then you click that same hotspot, it will focus in on what you've selected there. Okay, so it's similar to what we saw with dragging the wheel and orbiting. The view cube kind of behaves the same way. So I encourage you to spend a little bit more time practicing with each of the navigation tools. It's an important skill to kind of have under your belt because it makes it much easier for you to work in the software when you can easily get to the location of the model that you want to focus on. This video, I want to talk about a very important foundational skill, and that is object selection. Now, to help us with this, I'm in the architectural sample model that comes with the software, but you could really be in any project you like. As long as it's got some geometry in it, it should work just fine. But if you want to open up the architectural sample model that I'm in as well, you can get to it from the File menu, highlight Open, and then go to Sample Files, and then open up the architectural sample model. What I'm going to do is work in a floor plan for this example. So here under floor plans on the project browser, there's an L1 floor plan. I'm going to double click to open that up. And then I'm just going to put my mouse in the middle of the screen right here and roll a few clicks to zoom in a little bit more closely around the center of the screen. Okay, so selection is the first step in almost anything that you're going to do in Revit. So let's go through the various ways that we can select. Now let's start with the status bar in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. So notice that message there. It tells us that we can click to select, we can use the tab key to get alternates, or we can use the control and shift keys to help us select and deselect. So let's walk through each of those and I'll show you what that means. So let's start with click to select. First thing is, before you select anything, let's talk about pre-selection. So I'm going to move my mouse over this wall, but I'm not going to click yet. It will highlight that wall. It will give me some information in a tooltip. And notice that same information will appear on the status bar in the location where the message previously was about clicking to select and tabbing for alternates, right? It says walls, basic wall, exterior, and then some additional information after that. Now, what is that information? Well, if you watched an earlier video where we talked about the Revit hierarchy, that is an indication of the hierarchy of the element that I'm about to select. It is the walls category, the basic wall family, and then the rest of that message is the name of the type in this case. Now, if I move over to a different wall, say this one right here, again, I'll see a message that says walls, basic wall, and then this time it says a different name for the type. So what that's telling me is the first wall I highlighted is different than the second wall that I highlighted, but I'm getting the same basic information about each of those walls. If I click, it will select that wall. So now it's much more obvious because it's highlighted the entire wall there. So it's now selected. And in addition to seeing the message on my cursor there, notice that I'm seeing that same information now over on the properties palette, even when my mouse is moved away from the wall. So notice that that same information is available here. Now, walls is the category, but that's going to be listed underneath the family and type, which appears on the type selector above. So we've got walls here with a quantity of 1. That's telling me I have 1 wall selected. And then above that, it's telling me that wall happens to be basic wall family and then party wall 6 1/8 inch for the type. If I select a different wall, it will deselect the first wall in favor of the second one that I select. Now, the information on the properties palette will be similar. It's still a basic wall. It's still walls category. There's still 1 wall selected, but now it's telling me that this is a different type, exterior 12 5/8 rain screen. So the type is going to vary as I make different selections, but the rest of the information is staying largely the same. And you can continue to do this with different walls throughout this floor plan, and you'll see slightly different information. Now, it's not just walls, of course. We can select anything. Now, notice also that if I select an empty white space, it deselects everything. Okay, so when you're making selections, every time you click, it's creating a new selection, including if you click an empty space, it's making a new empty selection in that case. Now, let's say we come over here to this dimension object instead. Well, when I hover over it, it tells me the same basic information. Dimensions category, linear dimension is the family, linear trebuchet is the type, okay? And when I select it, I'm going to see that same information appearing on properties palette. So that's the click to select part. Now, what about the control adds and shift unselects? Well, let's start with a selection of maybe this wall right here. And remember, that's that party wall type. I'm going to hold down the control key. Notice the small plus sign that appears next to my cursor. And then that means I'm in add mode now. And if I come over here and select this wall, you can see that that wall is also a party wall. Now, the only thing that changes on the properties palette is the quantity now says 2. So otherwise, those 2 walls are the same category, family, and type. I've got a third one right over here. And if I click that, it now says walls 3, but all 3 of those are party walls. If I add to it this wall, Now you're going to see the quantity says 4, but notice that the type has changed to multiple types are selected. And that's because the 4 walls that I have selected don't all share the same type. So now it's not able to tell me one type or the other. It just says that there are multiples. What if you were to add a door to that selection? So I'm going to come over here and highlight this door 107B, and I'm going to control click it. And now it says multiple categories are selected on the properties palette. And then beneath that, it says common 5. Now you'll notice here that there are still some properties available on the properties palette. That's because there are some basic properties that are shared in common between both doors and walls. Not many, but there are a few. Well, what if you hold the control key and you add a dimension to the mix? Well, now it says common 6, but notice that I have no more common properties. So there isn't anything in common between the categories of wall, door, and dimension. So it's simply telling me the quantity in this case and nothing further. So as you make your selections, just be on the lookout for the different clues that you see available to you there on screen. And it kind of gives you some hints about what you're able to do with that selection. Now, with the control key, we were able to add to the selection. If you want to remove from the selection, we use the shift key. Notice now we'll get a little minus sign next to the cursor. And then I can click something to remove it. So that removes the dimension. I'm back to common 5. Then I'll remove this exterior wall and I'm back to common 4. Let's remove the door and I'm back to 3 party walls. Okay. If I click an empty space, it deselects everything. So those are the absolute basics of selection. But you recall that there was also the note that said we could tab for alternates. What does that mean? Well, the way this works is you start off by pre-highlighting something first. So let me put my mouse maybe over here next to this wall between these 2 restrooms. And then I'm going to press the tab key. Now, even though my mouse is favoring the wall, there was a plumbing fixture nearby. So when I tab, it sort of jumps over to that plumbing fixture. Now, if I tab again, it goes back to the wall. So depending on which object you want to select, you just tab until the one that you want is highlighted, and then you click. Now, it's very important that you understand that it's in that sequence. You highlight, you tab 1 or more times, and then you end with a click. So let's try that again, right? I'm going to click an empty space. I'm going to put my mouse in the same general area. I'm going to tab over, and this time I'm going to highlight the plumbing fixture and click, and I can select that plumbing fixture. Okay, so that's the first way that you can use the tab key. But there's an even more powerful way that you can use it. What if I hover over this wall instead? This time when I press tab, it will sense that there's another wall nearby connected in what Revit calls a chain. Now, a chain is 2 walls touching endpoint to endpoint. So now it's highlighting both of those walls. And if I click, I'm going to select the chain of walls. And over here, it says that there are now 2 walls selected. Now, there's lots of chain opportunities on this screen here. If I go to this exterior wall here and I press the tab key, notice that the chain is going up to the left and it's going all the way down and around to the right. And if I were to click, it'll deselect the first chain and it will select the new chain instead. And you can see that that was 7 walls. Depending on your project and the configuration of your walls, you could select dozens, if not hundreds of walls with a single click using this method. So this can be a very powerful way to make what otherwise would be a very tedious selection. So definitely spend some time practicing the chain selection and the tab key, and don't get frustrated with it. I know that it can take a little practice to get it, but just keep reminding yourself, you highlight, then you tab, and then finally you click in order to make that selection. Now, what if you want to select a lot of stuff all at once? Well, using the shift and control keys and picking them one at a time is definitely not going to be the most efficient way to go. What you can do is if you click and drag, you can make a box selection either going from the left to right or from right to left. When you go from left to right, it's got a solid edge. And when you go from right to left, it's got a dashed edge. What's the difference? The solid edge box must completely surround the items that you want to select. So let me demonstrate by starting here in empty space, and I'll slowly start to drag in this direction. Notice it didn't actually select that column until I completely surrounded it. I had to completely surround that plumbing fixture in order to get it. And then the bigger I make this box, the more elements will begin to be selected. And then when I let go, I now have 45 elements selected with a single click and drag operation. Now, let me contrast that to a crossing selection. So I'm going to click an empty space to deselect, and I'm going to start at the extreme corner of that first box that I made, click and hold down, and start dragging in the opposite direction from right to left. And notice that it's highlighting considerably more elements this time. And when I let go, instead of 46, this time I have 78. So in order to be selected with the dashed box, it just simply needs to touch that element and then it will be selected. So those are going to be much quicker ways to make selections of lots of elements. Now, you look at this selection and you say, what could I possibly want to do with a selection like this? Well, usually you're going to use the windows and crossing selections to get started, and then you're going to move on to a command here called filter. With filter, you can remove from the selection categories that you're not interested in. So let's say from this selection, I only wanted the walls in the area that I've selected. I could go to this filter button and notice all the categories that I've selected here. And each one lists with a count in the right-hand column. And there's lots of stuff here. Well, you can start unchecking the categories that you don't want, but more efficient is to do check none, then scroll down, locate the category or categories that you do want. So maybe I only want walls and doors, and then I click OK, and it will deselect everything except for walls and doors in that area. And if you compare that, there's 12 elements in my selection. If you compare that to clicking 12 times with the control key, then clearly I think that is a more efficient way to go. So that's a very powerful way to make selections. But there's just one more that I want to share with you, and that is selecting by type. So think of the method I just showed you with the filter tool as selecting by category, because you're making a big selection and then removing categories you don't want. Well, you can right-click an element as well. So if I right-click this door here, there's a select all instances option, and you've got a few different choices here. Visible in the view is probably the safest and the one that you're going to use the most often, but there also is this option for entire project. Let me show you visible in the view first. And over here, it tells me that there was only one door like that. So that was probably a bad choice. Let me try a different one. Let's try this door right here. Select all instances, visible in the view. There we go. That's a little bit more interesting. There are 12 of those doors. Okay. Now I'm going to right click again and choose entire project. And you see how that quantity jumps from 12 to 20. Now, there are only 12 visible in this view, but there are 20 throughout the entire model. So you just want to be careful when you make your choice there, because I probably wouldn't want to click delete right now or make any other drastic change to the selection of 20 elements, because I'd be changing 8 of them that I can't see on screen. Okay, at least with the 12 that I can see, I could react right away to the change I made. And if it was something I didn't like, I can undo. So I encourage you to experiment a little bit further with each of those selection methods. It's really important that you get comfortable with all of those different methods, because making selections is just a really important part of everything that you're going to do in Revit. And so the more comfortable you are quickly being able to strategize and make a good selection, just the easier that your modification tasks will go in general. In this video, I want to talk about some of the overall system-wide options that you can configure in Revit. I'm not actually in an exercise file. There's no need to have a file open for this topic. So I'm here on the home screen. If you want to customize the options, however, you need to be able to see the ribbon. So to see the ribbon, you can use this back button right here at the top of the home screen. Or you can open a file. It won't hurt anything if a file is open, but I'm going to simply do it this way. Then I'm going to go to the File menu, which is now available, and then choose the Options button, which is right here. So there are a number of tabs here in the Options dialog, and if you watched the video on changing your theme, then we've already explored the Colors tab in that previous video. So I'm going to skip over that now, obviously, and you can go back and watch that video if you want to learn more about themes. But here on the General tab, let's start right at the top where it says Notifications. This is probably the most important setting in this dialog, because it's talking about saves and save reminders. And you'll notice that mine is set to 30 minutes by by default. Now that's the default setting that Revit uses. You can change it if you like right here. You can go as low as 15 minutes, or you can even turn it off altogether with no reminders. Now, I highly recommend that you leave the reminder turned on. 15 minutes might be a little too frequent. I think 30 is fine for most users. I really do not recommend no reminders. What is this doing exactly? Well, if 30 minutes elapse and you haven't saved, Revit will remind you that it's time to save. Now, if you think about how important that could be, if you let lots of time go by without a save, and then you should have some sort of a failure on your computer and the system closes or you lose power or something like that, you could lose a lot of work. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to save regularly. And having a reminder to do that is just a really helpful way to make sure that you don't forget. So I'm going to leave mine set to 30 minutes. I recommend that you do the same, or that you configure an increment to your own liking, but I really don't recommend that you turn it off. You want to leave that set. Now, the next area is username. That is probably grayed out if you are logged into your Autodesk account. If for some reason you are not logged into your Autodesk account, there will be a button there that allows you to log in. Now, if you're on subscription, then you must be logged in order to access your Revit software. If you're not on subscription, then it's possible that you won't be logged in, and so you might see something different there. So just talk to whoever your support folks are to sort all that out if you see something different. I'm going to jump down to view options at the bottom of this screen next, and you'll notice that the default view discipline is coming in as coordination for me. And that's because I just installed Revit recently, and that's the default discipline. Now, my discipline is architectural. So pretty early on after installing the software, I recommend that you open up the default view discipline here and change it to whatever you identify yourself as. So for me, it's architectural. If you're working in another discipline, you can choose that. Now, what that does is it just sets the default discipline for any new view that you create. Now, you can always change the discipline of a view later. So if you forget to do this, it's not that big of a deal. But if you don't want to have to keep changing it after the fact, then the easiest way to prevent that is to just set your default here, and that establishes your preference going forward. So architectural for me. Next, I'm going to move on to the user interface tab here. And I just want to talk about these checkboxes at the top. Now, notice that all of them are checked for me except for this one at the very bottom, infrastructure tools. In this course, we're not going to do anything with the infrastructure tools, so leaving that one unchecked is perfectly fine. But I do recommend that you have all of the other ones checked just so that your screen matches mine more closely. However, it's possible that some of those might be unchecked for you, and that just simply controls which tabs are available on the ribbon in the background. So if there are certain disciplines that you don't care about, maybe you're not interested in the systems tab or something like that, you can uncheck it and simplify your interface a little bit with those choices. Okay, so again, those are your personal preferences. Feel free to change them if you like, but I recommend checking all of those boxes there. All right, so the next thing I want to do is skip down to hardware here. And what this is going to do is tell you whether or not your current system hardware meets the minimum requirements of Revit. Now, it's really only checking to see that you meet the minimum requirements. You might far exceed Revit's minimum requirements. It's not telling you anything about that, but you can see here that the computer that I'm working on has a nice green check mark for each of these items. So it supports the minimum requirements, which is generally a good thing. If yours does not look like this, then you might want to think twice about the computer you're using to run Revit on, because Revit is pretty robust and requires a computer with some pretty sophisticated hardware. So it's a really good idea that you make sure that your hardware tab here has a green light for each of those items, if you can at all manage it. All right, now this is related to the setting that we changed on the first tab for the discipline. This is a list of template files that will become available to you for creating new projects. And you can add to this list, you can remove from this list, and you can reshuffle the list and move it around. So you'll see this entry here at the top is the imperial template for me. I'm going to leave it set that way because I'm going to be working in imperial units. But if you prefer metric units, you could take the metric item, for example, and you could use this up arrow to move it to the top of the list. Whichever one is at the top of the list is your default template, but you can always access other templates as well. Now, if you're working in an office environment where you have a BIM manager that's configuring your system for you, it's possible that your office standard template might be listed there. So your screen might look a little different than mine. I don't recommend that you change it if you're in that scenario. Just leave it the way that your BIM manager has set it up, and you can certainly ask them if you have any questions about that. Now, the There's a variety of other tabs here. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can explore some of them on your own if you like, but there are user configurable settings in all of those locations. But as you can see, there was just one or two things that I wanted to change here, but I did want you to be aware of this dialog and the fact that there are a number of settings that are global that affect your entire Revit experience. And so once you change them, you shouldn't need to change them again. Revit project files can be configured in one of two ways. They can be either single user files where only one user can access the file at a time, or you can set them up as a team project where multiple users can access and save changes to the file at the same time. Now, if you're working in a small firm on smaller projects, then single-use files could work just fine. But in larger projects or in larger project teams, single-use files will not be conducive to team collaboration. Therefore, in those cases, we're going to need to set up the files for multi-user access. Now, Revit's word for that is work sharing. So whenever you hear somebody talk about a workshare enabled project or the work sharing concept in general, what they're talking about is simply team projects, projects where multiple users can access and save changes to the file at the same time. Now, in this course, we're going to be working exclusively with single-use files, simply for convenience of working together and to ensure the simplest user experience. However, if you're working in a firm, there's a really good chance that you're going to be working in workshare projects more frequently, if not all of the time. So in this video, I simply wanted to talk about the concept and make sure that you're familiar with the terminology and also give you some tools to identify when you're working in one or the other type of project. So I don't have an exercise file for you in this video. Workshare projects don't lend themselves to being easily shared as exercise files. So simply watch my screen here. I'm going to give you the clues on how to identify what kind of project you're in, but there's really nothing for you to do in terms of following along in this video. So let's start with the recent file screen that you can see visible here on screen for me. I have a variety of files shown here. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is these little badges that you see here in the corners of the files. Now, I'm going to start with one of the files that doesn't have a badge at all. This sample file that is right here. If I hover over it, you'll notice that the saved path for that file is on my C drive. Now, that's one of the sample files that's provided with the software, and it is a single user or standalone project. Only one user could access this file at a time. If I opened the file and then another user who had access to that same location tried to open the file, they would get a message that says the file's read-only and they have to wait until I'm done with it before they could save. That's what I mean by a standalone or a single user file. Now, next to that, I have this file here called Tower. This one is actually also a single-use file, but it's stored in a cloud location. So the only difference between these two is where it lives. This one lives on my C drive. This one lives in the cloud. But in both cases, both of those files are standalone single-user files. And again, if somebody else tried to access that file simultaneously, the second person would get the read-only message. The next two to the left are Workshare-enabled projects. So this one is a Workshare-enabled project that is using my local area network. So it has a main file that is saved on my network, and anyone with access to the same network as me would be able to access this file. Multiple users would be able to open it simultaneously, make changes, and save those changes to the master file, which we call a central file. So that master copy is called a central model, and it usually lives on a network server and is usually maintained by somebody in your IT department or your BIM manager or just somebody with knowledge of how to manage Workshare-enabled projects, and central models will usually have that responsibility. Now, the one next to it is also a Workshare-enabled project, but you'll notice the little superimposed cloud icon on its badge. So that is telling me that this Workshare-enabled project is saved in the cloud. So rather than saving it on my local area network, it is saved up in the cloud, but otherwise it is also a team project. So what this boils down to is, of the four options I've shown you here, it's really just the difference between team or non-team and then saved locally versus saved in the cloud. Okay, so when you combine those two possibilities with the other two possibilities, you get 4 total options, which is what I'm showing you here. Okay, so what I want to show you now is when you've identified that you have a workshare enabled project, how do you access it and how do you open it up? So if it's previously been opened, it's as simple as clicking it here on the recent file screen, and it will open it up and do everything correctly that you need to do. But what if you've never opened it before? Let's walk through that scenario. So let's say that you've just joined a project team and the manager of the project tells you where the project is located and gives you instructions on how to access it so that you can open it up and join the team. Well, that involves going to the open command over here, and then you will simply browse to the location of that file. Now, for me, that's on a D drive on this machine, and the D drive is simulating my office network in this scenario. So yours might be a different drive letter, or you might access it through a UNC path. So again, you'll get those instructions from your BIM manager or whoever's in charge of the project. Once you get there and you locate a Revit file, when you select it, the way that you can tell that this is a workshare enabled project is at the bottom of this dialog where it says work sharing. So notice that it says work sharing, and more importantly, there's 2 checkboxes that are lit up and available to check. Now, by default, it checks the correct one, which is create new local. In almost all circumstances, I would say 99.9% of the time, that's the correct option. You want to do create new local before you click open. So it'll already be checked. So you just simply need to verify that that box is checked and then move on to the step of open. In very rare instances, you might detach from central. Now notice if I check that, it unchecks create from local. So you can't do both. It's one or the other. And in even rarer instances, you might uncheck both. If you uncheck both, you are opening the central model, which is generally considered to be not recommended in almost all cases. So again, before you do that, please check with somebody in knowledge of the project at your firm before you do that in a real project. It's very serious. So in almost all cases, you're going to want to click create new local. It should already be checked, and then simply click open. Now, it's possible you might see a message like this if you've already been in the project previously. This is simply asking me what to do with yesterday's local copy. So each morning you're going to create a new local copy, and then you can either overwrite yesterday's or you can keep yesterday's and append a timestamp to it. Now, I like to do that, but it really doesn't matter. It's a matter of personal preference in that option. So just pick either option, whichever one appeals to you, and then it's going to open up the project. Now, again, I didn't provide this as an exercise file, so you can't follow along, but what you'll be greeted with is something like this. It's going to open up as a Revit project, and then in all ways, now you're just working in Revit. So the only thing that was really different there is the way that you located and accessed the project and making sure that you were actually creating a local copy instead of working directly in the central model. Now, I just want to point out a few differences in the user interface once you're in a workshare enabled project so that you can identify that you're here. So there are a few cues. On the view control bar, you will have this pop-up menu here, which was not available in a standalone project. So it looks like this little collection of colored cubes. And when I open that menu, it's got these options for work sets and checkout status and so on. Those are all workshare enabled specific functions. Now, down here on the status bar, is an option that says work set 1 for me. If you've got a pop-up menu here, and if it has any options at all, if it's not just simply grayed out, that means you're in a workshare enabled project. Okay, so just the presence of that menu with anything on it at all tells you you're in a workshare enabled project. The last cue or clue that you're in a workshare enabled project is right up here on the quick access toolbar next to the save icon. You should see the synchronize and modify settings icon. If you have that icon, you are in a workshare enabled project, because when we save our changes in a workshare project, we're actually synchronizing those changes with the central model. So the command is slightly different than just a normal save. Okay. So if you see those icons scattered around the user interface, then you know you're in a workshare project. If those icons are not there or they're grayed out, then that means you're in a standalone. And that's really all there is to it. So if you're asked to join a workshare enabled project, then that's going to be how you do it and how you can identify that you're there. Now, the last thing I want to point out to you, I'm just going to go back to my home screen here, is what about these two cloud ones that I showed you at the start? How did we get to those? Well, that's slightly more complicated because you need to have access to the cloud project in the first place. So the way you would do that is to click over here on Autodesk Docs, and somebody in your firm would have had to invite you to the cloud-based project before you could start. And then up here, you would have to choose the account and project. So in this example, I'm going to choose the appropriate project here. What you see will vary depending on the setup of that project, but this is just an example. And then when I browse into the appropriate folder, this is that cloud model, that standalone model that was saved in the cloud. And you can see right here, it says it's a cloud model. So that's how I can tell it's not work shared. This one says it's a work shared cloud model. So it's going to very clearly tell you the difference there, whether it's standalone or work share. But otherwise, you just simply click on it to open that up, and everything else would be as I've already indicated to you.